Hi, I'm Tessa, and this is the story of how I gave my mom a house and ended up sleeping in a shipping container behind it. They hosted Thanksgiving in my kitchen, toasted new beginnings at my table, and still left my name off the invitation. But what broke me wasn't the cold metal walls. It was the warmth they gave to everyone else, while pretending I no longer existed. Before we go any further, tell me, have you ever felt like an outsider in your own family? If yes, comment number 1. If no, comment number 0. This is a family drama you don't want to miss. I gave my mom my house. Not rented, not loaned, gave. So when my stepdad smirked and pointed me toward the shipyard, I thought it was a misunderstanding. It wasn't. The wind off Lake Erie had a bite to it, cutting straight through my coat as I stepped out of the car. Leaves skittered across the driveway like they were trying to escape something. From the street, the house looked familiar. Our house. White siding, porch swing, the shutters I'd helped repaint 2 summers ago. But something in the air had shifted. It didn't feel like mine anymore. I'd driven 10 hours straight, wanting to surprise Mom by arriving early to help with Thanksgiving. She used to love when I came home. Always met me on the porch, arms wide, asking if I wanted cider or chamomile tea first. This time, the door opened before I could knock, and it wasn't her. It was Ron. "You're early," he said, like I was a delivery gone wrong. I hesitated. "I thought I'd help set it up. I brought your old sweet potato recipe. Figured maybe." "We set something up for you out back," he cut in, not meeting my eyes. Then he turned and walked away. I stood for a second, suitcase handle still in my grip, the air biting at my cheeks. Then I followed, dragging the wheels over the gravel, dodging a rake someone had left propped against the fence. The backyard looked smaller than I remembered, less welcoming. A shipping container sat at the far corner, gray and hunched like it was trying to disappear. The padlock hung loose. Ron pulled the door open. It groaned like it hadn't moved in years. "Should be dry in there," he said. "There's a lamp. We ran an extension cord." Inside, a cot with a thin mattress leaned against one wall. A single wool blanket sat folded on top. No heater, no insulation. The air smelled of paint thinner and rust. I stared at the cot, then back at him. "The guest room under renovation," he added. My gaze shifted to the second-floor window. Through the blinds, I saw the guest room door. Open, perfectly made bed. The towels I'd bought for Mom's birthday still rolled in a basket at the foot. I didn't say anything, just nodded once and stepped inside the container. The metal groaned behind me as Ron left. I let my suitcase fall beside the cot and sat down slowly. Rust flakes dotted the frame, and the mattress squeaked beneath my weight. I ran my fingers along the blanket. Not the yellow one. Not the one I crocheted for Mom the year after her knee surgery, when I stayed home for 3 months to help. The chill crept up my legs as I sat there. I looked around. Corrugated walls, one dangling bulb, an outlet trailing from the doorframe. I took a breath and stood again. Inside the house, warmth hit me like a wave. Turkey in the oven, someone humming. Paige's laugh came from the sunroom, sharp, high. My blanket, the yellow one, was draped over Ron's legs as he sat reclined on my old couch. Mom was next to him, smiling, her hand resting lightly on Paige's arm. I stepped into the kitchen. No one looked up. The clink of silverware and hiss of a boiling pot filled the room. I opened my mouth, something about a space heater, but the words didn't land anywhere. No one responded. I backed out. Mom once promised, "You'll always have a home with me." She just never said which part of it. Back in the container, I closed the door. The metal echoed through the space. I didn't bother turning on the lamp. I sat on the cot again, pulled my phone from my pocket, and scrolled without looking. My thumb paused over a name. Gene Kaplan. I didn't call him, not yet, but I stared at his name longer than I meant to. Something had already shifted. The Thanksgiving invitation sat on the fridge, gilded and glossy. My name wasn't on it, not even as a +1. It caught my eye when I reached for the orange juice. Centered perfectly among magnets and family photos, the invitation was printed on heavy cardstock, gold edges shimmering under the kitchen light. Hosted by Marie and Ron Ashcroft, it read. Friends and family, welcome! Below that, a list of RSVP names. Paige, Mr. Lindell from the church, even the Barkers from down the street. But not me. I traced the edges with my eyes once, then again. Still not there. Years ago, Mom had leaned across a table at the Juniper Cafe and said, "Let's host Thanksgiving together someday. Just us girls. Your sweet potatoes, my cranberry relish." I remember laughing and promising to wear the apron she stitched in college. That dream dried up somewhere between the engagement ring and the deed transfer. I turned toward her now, where she stood ironing a table runner at the kitchen island. "Mom," I said softly, "the invitation, it doesn't have my name." She barely looked up. "Oh, sweetheart, must have been a printing mistake. We used one of those online templates." Ron walked in just then, holding a tray of wine glasses. "It's a family dinner," he said with a smirk, not looking at me. Probably just assumed. No one else flinched. The oven timer dinged. Paige shouted something from upstairs about chargers not matching napkins. Marie moved to check the pie crusts. I grabbed my coat. The door creaked more than I remembered. Out in the cold, I walked toward the docks. The shipyard's metal fences rattled gently with the wind. Wendell was sitting on an overturned bucket near the guard shack, his coat zipped to his chin, and an old navy ball cap pulled low. I didn't speak, just handed him a paper bag with a still warm muffin and the scarf I found buried in my trunk. Blue plaid. Not fancy, but clean. He looked at me, nodded once, and pulled it over his neck without a word. The silence between us felt fuller than anything in that house. I wandered a little farther, just past the rusted trailers, and sat on a bench facing the water. The air was cold enough to sting, but not enough to numb. I pulled out my phone and started scrolling, not really reading until something caught me. Faye Delaney had posted. We hadn't spoken in years, not since the library days, but her words landed like a stone skipping water. When women give too much, the world calls them dramatic when they ask for fairness. Property, labor, time. The receipts are always in someone else's name. I read it twice, then again. She was talking about someone else, some other story, and yet it pulsed under my skin. Back in the container, I sat cross-legged on the cot, the box of old folders spread beside me. My breath fogged as I thumbed through manila tabs. Mortgage, insurance. Then one labeled Transfer 2020. The notary seal was there. So was my signature. But something felt unfinished. I didn't remember getting confirmation. I couldn't recall any filing receipt. I opened my email and began typing. "Hi, Jean. I hope this isn't too last minute, but could you check something for me? I'm not sure if the deed was ever finalized. There's no rush, but I'd appreciate clarity. Thanks, Tessa." I hesitated before clicking send. The wind rattled the door. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear laughter from the main house. Paige again, loud and bright. The blankets around me weren't enough to block it out. Then my phone buzzed. "Tessa, the house is still under your name. They never filed the transfer." I feel their distance, in every gesture, every word, especially letting me sleep outside the house that is supposed to be mine. I need to do something for myself. Do you think I should do that? Please leave a comment number 9 in the comment section below. Now let's get to the next development of this story. They took the house, the couch, even the blanket I made. But they underestimated the power of one quiet call. Thanksgiving morning was quiet and eerie. No cars, no voices, just the hum of a town holding its breath in cinnamon and gravy. I sat on the edge of the cot, wrapped in a second sweater I'd found in the bottom of my duffel. The coffee in my cracked mug tasted faintly of metal and instant regret, but it was warm. That counted for something. The sky outside was a pale gray, the kind that made roofs and roads blur at the edges. I could see shadows moving in the kitchen window. Marie's silhouette, I guessed, gliding between oven and island. Every so often, laughter floated across the yard, followed by the clink of silverware. Through the metal walls, everything sounded thinner, like memory stretched too far. I picked up the phone. Gene answered on the second ring. "Morning, Tessa," he said, voice groggy but alert. "You all right?" "I'm still listed," I said quietly. "You were right." There was a pause. "Yeah, still under your name. Transfer was signed but never filed. That means—" "I own it," I said, finishing for him. "You want me to draft something formal?" "Yes, a letter. I want it delivered tomorrow." "Will do," he said, no further questions. That's what I appreciated about Gene. He didn't press, just moved. I ended the call and stared at the blank page in my notebook for a long minute before writing. November 24th. Ownership confirmed. No filing in county records. Guest room visibly clean. Blankets missing. Kitchen occupied. My name excluded. Each sentence steadied me. Around mid-morning, I heard footsteps outside. I opened the container door just enough to see Wendell standing there, holding a grocery bag awkwardly in one arm. His eyes were watery from the cold, not age. "I brought you something," I said, handing him a wrapped plate. Ham, mashed potatoes, a small square of stuffing I'd managed to pull together from my stash of dry goods and vending machine finds. He looked down at the foil, then back up. "You didn't have to," he said. "I know." He started to turn, then stopped. "If anyone needs to hear what I saw, the night you came, or the way he talked, I'll say it. I remember what decency looks like." I nodded. "That might matter." He didn't linger, just nodded once more and left with the same silent pace he'd come in on. The scarf I gave him yesterday was tucked neatly under his jacket collar, blue plaid. By noon, I had built out 2 more pages in my notebook. I had tabs labeled with sticky notes, quotes, key dates, details I wouldn't remember if I let emotion take over. There was something about writing it down that made it real, less like betrayal and more like architecture. I wasn't unraveling. I was rebuilding. From inside the house came the unmistakable rhythm of glasses toasting. I heard Ron's voice rising above the others. To the ones who build and the ones who bless. Then more laughter. I sat back, pen still in hand. And then came the bang. The container door shuddered as Ron's fist hit it again. "You're stirring trouble, aren't you?" he shouted. "Think I don't know what you're up to?" I stood slowly, smoothed my sweater sleeves, and pulled open the door with both hands. The light hit his face, red from the cold or from fury. I couldn't tell. "You'll want to read what arrives tomorrow," I said. He blinked, confused for just a second. Then the smirk returned. "You think you're clever?" I closed the door gently in his face. No slam. Just enough steel to signal that I wasn't afraid. Back inside, the container was still cold, but something in me had shifted. That night, long after the fork stopped clinking and the porch light dimmed, my phone buzzed once. Faye. Hey, I saw something. People need to know? Can I help? They used my house as a stage, hosted strangers in my kitchen, and still had the nerve to leave my name off the door. The smell of roasted garlic hit me before I even reached the porch. It was warm inside, glowing behind the drawn curtains, and candlelight flickering against the windows. I stood there a moment longer than I needed to, letting the cold wind bite at my cheeks. Then I pressed the latch and walked in. No one turned. Voices floated through the hallway, pages high and clear, Ron's deeper, the kind that filled space and refused to leave room for others. A woman I didn't recognize was laughing at something he'd said about renovations. Someone mentioned how the home felt elegant but cozy. I walked past them all without a word, moving through the hallway like a ghost with a key. The dining room was dressed like a magazine shoot. Ivory napkins, gold-rimmed plates, personalized place cards, each one written in neat cursive. I scanned the row. No Tessa, no Jensen, just Ashcroft. Again and again. I sat down at the farthest end of the table. No one asked why. No one acknowledged I'd arrived. Marie floated in from the kitchen, her dress the same deep maroon she used to wear for choir performances. Her eyes landed on me, briefly. They flickered. Recognition, maybe, or regret. But they didn't stay. She looked down and continued arranging rolls. Across from me, Paige twirled a fork in one hand and whispered something to the woman beside her. They both looked down at the table, then looked away. I folded my hands in my lap and didn't touch the glass of water in front of me. The chair cushion was thinner than I remembered. I wondered if they'd replaced it, or if it was just the weight of everything that made it feel different. Ron stood at the head of the table, arms wide, wine glass lifted high. "To this house," he said, "and to everyone who helped us build it." Everyone raised their glasses. I didn't move. The clinking of the crystal was followed by polite applause. I reached for my fork, slid it lightly across the porcelain plate. The sound sliced through the air before vanishing into the low hum of conversation. I set it back down. Somewhere behind me, I heard the click of a phone camera. Quiet, purposeful. "May I sit?" a voice whispered. I turned. Faye Delaney. She hadn't changed much. Same silver hoop earrings, same steady gaze that once hushed an entire library full of freshmen. She didn't wait for an answer before sliding into the chair beside me. "You gave more than they'll ever return," she said, her voice barely above the rustle of napkins. "But you're not invisible to me." She glanced down at her phone, then back at the room. "I'm not recording anyone's face, just the table, just this contrast." I said nothing. She angled the camera discreetly. 30 seconds, maybe less. Just the laughter, the toast, the polished silver, and me. Silent, still, present. No one noticed. Not Ron, not Paige, not Marie, who was now laughing with the woman from church, the one who'd always commented on my Christmas sweaters. By the time dessert was brought out, pumpkin tarts and pecan pie, I had already slipped from the room. No one followed. No one asked where I'd gone. Back in the container, I sat on the cot, wrapped in the quiet like a familiar shawl. The glow from the main house bled faintly through the blinds. My phone buzzed. Faye had tagged me. The caption was short. "When you give everything, and they still pretend you're not at the table." By midnight, it had 400,000 views. By morning, the headline reads, "Woman slept in Shipyard, while her family hosted Thanksgiving in her house." The sheriff's boots landed on the porch like thunder, but it was the silence afterward that split the house. I stood just beyond the front hallway, fingers wrapped around a mug that had long gone cold. Outside, clouds still hang low, heavy with the kind of gray that never quite turns into rain. The cruiser idled at the curb, engine quiet, but unignorable. It all felt like the pause before a verdict. The knock came. Firm 2 taps, measured like a clock, striking an hour that couldn't be avoided anymore. Ron answered the door like it was beneath him, brows lifted, mouth curled in practiced condescension. "Can I help you?" he said, even as the sheriff extended a clipboard. "Eviction notice," the deputy said, not unkindly. "Filed yesterday afternoon. Effective immediately. This property is registered under Tessa Jensen. You and any other non-title holding residents have 48 hours to vacate." Ron's smirk tightened, the first real crack in his expression forming. This is some kind of joke, right? The house was signed over. I stepped forward then, quiet but unmistakable. It was signed, but never filed, which means legally it never changed hands. He spun to face me, that sharp flick of indignation I'd come to expect rising behind his eyes. "You've been plotting this." "I've been surviving this," I replied. Behind him, Marie had come halfway down the stairs. She was still in her house shoes, robe belted tight, like she hadn't meant to witness this moment, but couldn't not. The deputy cleared his throat and held out a second document. "Verified by the county registrar. This is official, sir." That's when Wendell stepped up the porch. He moved slowly but surely, holding a protective plastic folder under one arm. "I brought this," he said, handing it to the deputy. "Statement from me. I saw her sleeping in that shipyard. Didn't seem like anyone cared that she was freezing in her own backyard." The deputy nodded and tucked it under the rest of the paperwork. "You don't even know what's going on," Paige's voice rang out behind me. She stormed into view, eyes blazing, arms folded like armor. "She's just bitter she gave it up." Wendell looked her dead in the eye. "She fed me when I had nothing. That's what family looks like." Paige scoffed, turning toward Marie. "Say something! Tell them this is crazy!" But Marie said nothing. Her hands were clenched at her sides, knuckles white. Her gaze never left the floorboards. I looked back at Ron. "You played house in my home. That's over." He stepped toward me then, fists balled, jaw tight. "You think you can just waltz in and take it all back like some—" "Sir," the deputy interrupted, stepping between us, calm but firm, "I recommend you start packing." The silence that followed was sharper than any shout. Outside, the low hum of a news van pulling up cracked the stillness. Faye stepped out with a camera bag over one shoulder, her eyes scanning the scene. She didn't lift the lens yet. She didn't need to. The story was already written itself. Across the street, a few neighbors stood at their fences, pretending to sweep leaves, their eyes fixed on the porch. I recognized Mrs. Dillard from 2 doors down. She clutched her thermos tighter when Ron noticed her staring. Paige turned her fury on me again. "This isn't your win!" she hissed. I didn't respond. Marie sat down on the staircase then, her posture slowly folding in on itself. At her feet rested a single suitcase, worn, zipped, silent. Then came the crash. A glass flew from Paige's hand, hit the hallway wall to my left, and exploded into shards. The sound rang through the house, followed by the sharp clink of glass settling on tile. I didn't flinch. The deputy stepped forward. "Ma'am," he said to Paige, firm but controlled, "I suggest you take some time to gather your things." Ron stood frozen. Marie stared straight ahead. And I, finally, felt the ground steady beneath me. Not because of the noise, but because I was no longer the one being erased. She knocked at dawn, coat wrinkled, voice cracked, not asking for forgiveness, just shelter. I'd already been awake, standing barefoot in the kitchen with the kettle starting to steam. The soft clink of the spoon in my mug was the only sound, besides the low murmur of jazz drifting from the radio. Outside, the sky was just beginning to pale. Inside, the lace curtains softened the edges of the morning. It was the kind of quiet I hadn't known in years, earned, not gifted. Then came the knock. 3 soft taps. Cautious, uncertain. The kind you make when the door might not open. I knew before I reached the handle who it was. Marie stood on the porch in a coat too thin for the weather, her shoulders hunched against the chill. Her hair was pinned up the way she used to do when rushing between choir and church dinners, but it had lost its neatness. There was no suitcase, just a canvas bag slung across her body, and a tremble in her breath. "Ron's gone," she said, eyes not meeting mine. "Took the savings, took the car. I didn't know." She swallowed. "I just need a place for a few nights." I said nothing. I turned back into the house, retrieved the envelope I'd left by the entry table the night before. Already stamped, already folded. The motel voucher was inside, along with enough cash for a few days' meals. "I printed this yesterday," I told her, holding it out. "I had a feeling." She stared at it for a moment before taking it in both hands, her fingers tightening around the paper. She didn't ask why. She didn't plead. The porch groaned beneath us as we stood there, just long enough to register the absence of anything that might have passed for comfort. She glanced over her shoulder toward the empty street, then back at me. Finally, she murmured, "I thought I was protecting us." My voice was steady. "Sometimes, what you call protection feels like exile." She gave a small nod. Then she turned and walked down the steps. No hug, no apology, no glance back. I stood there until she was gone. Back inside, the kettle had begun to hiss. I poured the water into my mug, cinnamon tea, a dash of honey, and carried it into the sunroom. It had once been hers. Years ago, I built it for her, stitched the cushions by hand, planted basil and rosemary along the sill because she said herbs should live where light finds them first. I even sewed a little pillow with her initials, tucked it into the window seat. Now it was mine again. And I had no plans to share. The rosemary had survived the cold snap last week. New green shoots reached toward the glass, bold and defiant. I brushed my fingers along the leaves and smiled at the scent it left on my skin. Behind me, the radio was playing something mellow. Ella, maybe, or someone trying to be. Wendell's letter sat on the windowsill, folded neatly with a blue ribbon. The paper was worn around the corners, his handwriting careful and sloping. "You saw me," he'd written. "I saw you too." I held it against my chest for a moment, then tucked it into the drawer beneath the bench. It didn't need to sit out to be seen. The house was still. No footsteps overhead. No laughter where it didn't belong. Just warmth and breath and steam rising slowly from my mug. I reached for my notebook, the one I started in the shipyard. Flipping past the pages filled with dates and voice memos, I landed on a fresh sheet. With the pencil steady in my hand, I wrote, "Next time, I'll save a key for the version of me you should have loved." The sun stretched higher along the wall, warming the rug beneath my slippers. I didn't move. I didn't need to. She didn't come back with excuses, just a suitcase and silence, asking for something she once refused to give. That morning, the house wasn't loud with apologies, but the sun still found its way through the curtains, warming the room. I reclaimed one quiet decision at a time. Sometimes the kindest boundaries are the ones that simply say, "You cannot stay, but I will not shut the door to kindness." Because grace isn't always loud, and justice doesn't always wear a gavel. It can be a cup of tea, a voucher printed in advance, or a chair left intentionally empty. If this story stirred something in you, perhaps take a moment to ask, who have we erased in silence, and what would it mean to truly see them again?